Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is about the United States pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement and the repercussions that's going to have. So a few days ago, President Trump made it official. He announced that the United States is no longer party to that international agreement about Iran developing civilian nuclear power. Now, every sovereign state has the absolute right to develop civilian nuclear power. The US government doesn't dispute that, nor does Israel. So why should Iran be an exception? And under this agreement, many governments agreed that Iran was entitled to develop nuclear power and had to agree that it would never develop nuclear weapons and so forth, submit to an inspections regime, so forth. There was a limit to the amount of nuclear power it could develop for 15 years, no limit after that. Sanctions were lifted in return, so commerce increased and the country became more prosperous. Now, this is a terrible thing to do on behalf of President Trump. Why should anyone trust the US government in future? It shows bad faith. It's of questionable legality. Imagine if Iran had broken the agreement, had unilaterally said, we're pulling out, we decided it's a bad agreement. You can imagine the howls of outrage and protest from Washington, Tel Aviv, and elsewhere. But the Iranians were honoring the agreement. John Mattis said so recently. The UN inspectors have said so. They're completely abiding by the agreement. So the US has shown bad faith to the international community and is in breach of its obligations. It has other consequences. Trump is coming up to some very delicate negotiations with the North Koreans. Why should the North Koreans trust a single word he says? I know he's a serial liar, but he might pull out of an agreement. Admittedly, it was the Obama administration made this agreement. But agreements are made between countries, not between individuals, and governments are required to abide by the agreement a previous government of that country made. So Trump rails against Iran for helping the Syrian government. Well, one sovereign state is absolutely entitled to provide military assistance to another, just like the US provides military aid to Israel. And says that Iran is helping Hezbollah, which it certainly is, and very open about that. The deal did not encompass Hezbollah or other issues. So Iran is entitled to form alliances elsewhere. The Iranians say they're helping the Lebanese and Palestinian people. So Trump is doing this at the behest of the Israeli government and indeed the Saudi Arabians. Well, there's a bitter irony here. Israel does not tell the truth about its nuclear weapons status. Israel is not a signatory to the non-proliferation agreement, whereas Iran is. Israel does not permit any inspections, whereas the Iranians do. These are inspections the United States would never dream of allowing. So the Syrians would say they need Iranian troops, partly to defeat terrorism in their country, but also because they are threatened by Israel. And indeed, they are threatened by Israel. The Israelis launched rockets at Syrian targets a few days ago. When's the last time Syria's attacked Israel? Not for years. Syria's in no position to attack Israel apart from anything else. So this makes war more likely. In 2015, when this agreement was brokered, many people breathed a sigh of relief. They thought that a combination of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and a credible threat of military action had brought around this situation, that the day was saved, peace was assured. Now, it was controversial in Iran as well. Hawks didn't like it, just like in the United States, warmongers didn't like it. They were desperately disappointed that they didn't get the taste of blood again. And by the way, if they did fight Iran, it really would be a bloodbath. Someone said to me, there are millions of Iranians who really don't mind dying, whereas Americans do. And that's the thing. There is a warmongering element in the US public. It's not a majority. They want their war, but they're not willing to accept significant casualties on their side. Anyway, nobody claims that Iran has nuclear weapons at the moment, where everybody knows that Israel possesses nuclear weapons. Ehud Olmert, when he was Prime Minister, he blurted it out. He accidentally listed Israel as one of the nuclear weapon states. So anyway, other countries will continue trading with Iran, so these sanctions won't hurt them that badly. Trump is demanding that the EU join in, and they won't. He's going to fine EU companies that do business with Iran. So it's fractured UN. Fractured NATO. It's a distraction from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Niger, other countries where the United States is fighting. Now, Trump has kept his election pledge, and generally speaking, that's a laudable thing. However, why did he take 14 months to do it? If it's the worst deal ever, as he claimed, why did he sign off on its extension twice? How moronic, hypocritical, illogical. It can't have been that bad, otherwise he would have ended it on day one. So he says that billions of dollars have gone to Iran at that time, and that's true, because they've earned them by selling things. Their assets were frozen, they were unfrozen. It's their money in the first place. So I'm afraid to say this makes war more likely. If Iran does want a nuclear weapon, this will make them even more eager to get it in the short term, because they see that as the only way of dissuading the United States from invading them. It will ramp up tensions in Syria and Iraq and so on, where the Iranians have a military presence. It makes a war between them and Israel more likely, and between Iran and the Saudis more likely. There's already proxy wars in Syria, in Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, there's much to criticize in the Iranian government. The human rights record leaves something to be desired, and certain candidates are banned from standing for election. But it certainly wins the beauty contest as regards Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia just allowed women to drive. They've been allowed to drive for decades in Iran. Christians can worship freely in Iran. Even Jews can. The Jews are representation in the Iranian Majlis. They have elections there which are fairly free. There are several political parties. Saudi Arabia still doesn't allow political parties. So there's no question that Iran is streets ahead of Saudi Arabia in terms of civil liberty. So much for standing up for human rights and democracy, whilst fulminating against Iran, but turning Nelson's eye to wrongdoing in Saudi Arabia. This is absolutely not being anti-Saudi Arabian, not against the people. Had some wonderful Saudi Arabian students, but against the government denying people their rights. So there may well be airstrikes against Iran, and these will probably be ineffective. Frankly, I'm worried what's going to happen. So Trump was coming into the midterm elections, and he was trailing in the polls. Now, ramping up tensions with Iran has raised his popularity. He's only minus 10% in popularity now. He was minus 20% a few months ago. Then coming up for these talks in Singapore with North Korea. Well, it's a very high-risk strategy, but I think Trump has cried victory much too soon. This is the life cycle with North Korea. This has happened several times over the past few decades, that the two Koreas will come to the brink of war, and then they'll step back. And after a few months, relations become quite cordial. They will have a conference. There will be expressions of goodwill. Food aid will be given to North Korea, factories set up in North Korea, and it will seem like the regime is liberalizing. Then after a few years, that will fall apart. Tensions will rise again. The détente is over, and then they're eyeballing each other. So they just pocket some concessions. But Trump doesn't have the attention span or the historical knowledge to realize that. So I don't expect a breakthrough in Iran. If they want nuclear weapons that badly, they're going to go for them. They'll say the only reason North Korea hasn't been invaded is precisely because they possess nuclear weapons.